Hi, I'm Dr. Jackson Crawford. I'm a specialist in the Old Norse language, currently teaching at the University of California, Berkeley, formerly at UCLA, and as of August 2017, happy to be returning home to the Mountain States to teach at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm back today answering more Patreon questions. Today, supporter Andy Turnay asks whether the cyclical elements in the myth of Ragnarok that we see, for instance, in the poem Völuspá, have their roots in Christian influence on Norse myth. I'm going to broaden this question to address something I'm asked about very often, which is whether a lot of what we see in Norse myth is due to Christian influence. Well, one thing we have to keep in mind is that there is no such thing as a source for Norse mythology from the Middle Ages that is not influenced by Christianity, because the people writing these sources down were Christians. The Roman alphabet was brought to Scandinavia by the Christian Church, and it's only in the Roman alphabet that we see long written sources. The runes were never used for writing anything very long. Since Christians are writing these sources, we have to account for the possibility of Christian influence on anything and everything. However, we need to worry about it most in prose, not in poetry. Poetry, songs, and formulaic language like legal language are very resistant to change because they have certain structural elements that people have to keep intact, like rhyme or alliteration or just rhythm. Whereas prose, just plain language, does not have such constraints. So we need to be more worried about later influence on something like the Prose Edda, which is written in just plain language, than on the poems preserved in the Poetic Edda. Specifically, when it comes to Völuspá, the elements of the apocalypse described there, of Ragnarok, do have some similarity to those described in Revelation, but I don't think there's really enough to say that this is specifically Christian influence, nor do I think that the world that comes after Ragnarok, as described in Völuspá, sounds particularly like the Christian heaven. The area of Norse myth that I think actually is most subject to Christian influence is the modern 20th and 21st century assumption that there is a single, coherent, canonical Norse pagan tradition. The poems of the Poetic Edda are all composed at different times and places. Snorri then adds his own twists and interpretations, which often are probably influenced by his Christian upbringing. We're looking at several different layers of a belief system, not at one single canonical tradition that survives from one place and time. There was an article on the online magazine called Cracked a few years ago that claimed that Snorri Sturluson had probably just made up all of Norse myth. This is also pretty far-fetched, because the poems of the Poetic Edda, because they do have certain poetic constraints, can be dated often to before the Christianization of Iceland in the year 1000. Now, that may mean, of course, that even the poems that do survive from being composed before Christianity came later were influenced by Christianity, but again, we're back to a situation where there's simply no purity to be found. Like in any other aspect of life, there's no point we can go to where it's just, this is a pagan source written down by a pagan. We have at best pagan sources written down by Christians. But another thing to keep in mind is that the myths that are preserved don't have a particularly Christian coloring to them, and often preserve things that would be offensive to Christians. Consider Njal's saga, one of the sagas of the Icelanders, which preserves anti-Christian poetry. Or just the sentiments that are expressed in many of the poems of the Poetic Edda, which encourage the worship of the Norse gods and the use of runes and some kind of pagan rites. So I think that the Christian influence on Norse myth can be overstated, but it can also be understated, in as much as people's desire today to find one coherent system is probably the result of knowing one coherent system from, for example, the Christian beliefs of today. Well, I hope this has been somewhat helpful, and from the wilderness of the American West, middle of nowhere, Wyoming, which I like to call home, I'm wishing you all the best.